much for joining us today. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. Today, we are going to talk about the different types of investor visas, and those are visas that are available for coming to the United States. People who want to invest in the United States, people who want to buy businesses in the United States, or people who want to start businesses in the United States. We're going to go over a number of different options, but before we get started with that, just a few housekeeping items. If you do have any questions during the webinar, you can certainly type in those questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box. We will get to all chat questions and save time at the end for questions, or I may answer the questions as we're going through the webinar. The next thing is that this webinar is being recorded. So we will send you a number of different things after the webinar, including the recording. We will also send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and we will also send you a guide for each of the different visas or investor visa opportunities that we go through today. These are comprehensive guides that go through all of the requirements. Now, the way we're going to structure this presentation is we're going to go through investor visa by investor visa. However, there are separate webinars on each of these investor visa topics. Each of them, we could talk about them for an hour. So, and in fact, a lot of those webinars do talk about them for an hour. So we do encourage you to sign up for those webinars and or go to our YouTube channel, because as we make webinars available, we do post them to our YouTube channel. And that's the final thing, is that when we do post videos regularly, not just webinars, but other immigration videos. And we do encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to click the notification button so that you are notified when new YouTube videos are posted. And we do post these videos quite regularly, sometimes 3 or 4 a week. So without further ado, we will move into the presentation. And so, we've listed on this slide the 4 different types of investor visas that we're going to talk about. These are the primary investor visas. We can make arguments for other types of investor visas, but these are the primary ones that we see and are going to go through in a lot of detail. 3 of the 4, are very, very active. The E-2 visa, the National Interest Waiver for entrepreneurs, and the EB-5 green card. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much traction in the International Entrepreneur Rule as yet. It's a relative, even though it's a pronouncement that has been out for quite some time. Unfortunately, it hasn't been utilized very much, but perhaps that traction will pick up in the upcoming years. So let's first talk about the E-2 visa. Now, this visa is near and dear to our hearts, the firm, because our firm was founded on an E-2 visa 10 years ago. So, the first and foremost, to be eligible for an E-2 visa, you must be from a treaty country. There are a list of around 80 countries that are on the list, and they're from all over the world. Australia is on the list. Pakistan is on the list. Many countries in Europe are on the list. Canada is on the list. So many countries in South America are on the list as well, Argentina, Chile. So, so definitely the first thing to look at is, do I have a passport? And it doesn't matter where you're born, as long as you have a passport from that particular country, then you could be eligible to apply for an E-2 visa. And you think of that as a threshold issue, that the company that you start in the US has to be at least 50% owned by someone who is a national of the treaty country. So then the next thing that we look at is that the individual is going to invest in the US, and that can happen in 2 ways. They can start a business and then, put money in a US bank account and then start spending that money, or they can purchase a business in the United States. So, for example, they could purchase a restaurant, they could purchase a gas station, they could purchase a convenience store, they could purchase a franchise, which is, kind of doing home cleaning, or they could start a renovation business. Lots of different options. And really, when you think of an E-2 business, the options are endless. And really think of any business any legitimate business that will ultimately hire US workers, and then you would see that it would be possible for someone to qualify for an E-2 visa. When you're looking at an E-2 visa, the funds have to be at risk. So it's not possible to just set up a business entity and say, put $100,000 in a business bank account and consider that money spent, because the government says that you could just go to the bank account and withdraw that money. So it's not what they call at risk. So the money, it has to be at risk. And generally that means that the money has been spent. So if you're purchasing a business, you've given the money to the seller, or the money's in escrow. If you are starting a business, you've spent everything that's required to get the business up and running. And that's sometimes a scary proposition for people, because those expenditures have to be made before, not after, before you get the actual visa. The other thing with E2 visas is that we do have to sort out where the money came from, and it's a source of funds requirement, and the money has to come from legitimate source. So the money can come from personal savings, it can come from gift, it can come from the sale of a house, it can come from relatives. Really any legitimate means for obtaining the money, but you do have to document that path and source of funds where the money came from. And as I said before, it can be a gift or a loan from a relative or anybody that you know. The biggest question that we get with an E2 visa, and we're going to talk about it more during the next, when we get to the next slide, is just, how much do I have to invest? So the investment must be substantial. And as I said, we're going to talk about that when we get to the next slide, so we won't dwell on it right now. And then we look at typical E2 expenditures. If you're buying a business, it's going to just be the cost of the business. However, if you are starting a business, then really what you're looking at is spending enough money such that you have spent everything that's required to get the business up and running. So it could be marketing costs, could be inventory, if that's relevant, equipment, spending money on lease, even if you have employees, that it could be spending money on employees. So really anything that's required to get the business up and running. The next requirement for E2 visa has to do with employees. And the way that the legal terminology describes this is the business cannot be marginal. However, what that's really getting at is the business, you have to hire US workers. And there's no, just like the investment amount, there's no set amount that you have to spend. There's no set amount of employees that have to be hired, but really we're looking at, after a 5-year period, you want to be able to have the equivalent of at least 3 full-time employees to be able to renew the visa. The visa is going to be issued for anywhere from 3 months to 5 years, depending on which country you are, depending on which consulate that you go to, and depending on the strength of your case. Very few countries have a very short issuance period of 3 years, and even when 3 months rather, and even when you do get the visa only for 3 months, if you're a country like from Bangladesh, or there are a few other countries like that have very short, we call it reciprocity periods. Every time you enter the US, you're admitted for 2 years. But a lot of countries have 5-year visas, and then after the 5 years, you go back to the consulate to renew the visa, and the consular officer is really looking at how many employees you have hired, and after 5 years, you should have hired at least 3 employees, the equivalent of 3 employees. So it can be a combination of part-time, full-time, the equivalent of 3 full-time equivalents at the end of 5 years. The business has to be real and operating. So this really gets back to, again, what we said with respect to, you can't just have the intention to start a business and put money in a bank account and say, well, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. You actually have to spend the money. So that's a situation, again, that's scary for people, because they have to spend it before they get the visa. But most E2 visas are approved. They have very high approval rates, as published by government statistics. The government, I think, has an over 80% approval rate, and those are even people who applied on their own. And we have 97, 98% approval rate, although past results don't predict the future outcome. But generally a very high approval rate. The person has to be coming to the US to develop and direct the operation. So usually that means that they own 50% of the business, but also the E2 visa is not for passive investors. So we get a lot of people say, okay, well, I want to buy a piece of real estate and rent one piece of real estate out, and can I get an E2 visa for that? And it, sure, it might meet the substantial investment requirement if the property costs a lot of money, but that doesn't require employees. It's a passive investment. So the E2 investment is not for passive investors. And we talked about this, when you are buying a company, or if you're starting a company, the members of the treaty country have to at least own 50% of the company. And then the final requirement is that you have to have the intent to return to your home country if and when the visa expires. But this visa, as an investor, it can be renewed indefinitely. So it's not like they have a time limit. People have been in the US on an E2 visa for 20, 25, 30 years, lots of time. And that's not a problem at all. It can be renewed indefinitely as long as you meet the actual renewal requirements. So now coming back to the investment amount and how much is enough. And I think that the key thing to keep in mind here is there's two things really. One, that there's no set investment amount, but also that I think that a lot of clients come to us and they want a number. They say, look, how much should I spend? And they want a number. But I think we always discourage people from thinking about it that way, because there are lots of factors that impact that number. First and foremost, the type of business that it is. If you have a consulting business, you're obviously going to be able to invest a lot less than if you have, for example, a car manufacturing plant or another business that takes a significant amount of investment. The other the other thing that makes a difference is where you're applying. So some people that maybe are applying in Toronto are going to have an easier time than, for example, someone applying in the U.S. consulate in Paris, because each consulate applies their own standards with respect to kind of what is a reasonable investment amount for these types of cases. So you have to kind of keep that in mind as you're going through the process, and really have local knowledge with respect to the consulate that you're applying at, and whether or not that consulate requires a higher or low investment amount. And then the final thing is the overall strength of your case. So, for example, if you have a case that has factors that make the case strong, so perhaps it's a franchise that you're buying, or perhaps you're engaging in a business that the government is kind of already sees would have a large number of employees, like a restaurant or something like that. Or you may have other factors. You may have employees already. You may have a track record of proven success, or other things that make the case stronger. And if you have those things, then perhaps you can go in with a lower investment amount. But notwithstanding any of this, even if your business is a consulting business, we do recommend that you spend at least, that you have at least $40,000 worth of expenditures that you've made before you apply. So the next thing to touch on is we touched on this a little bit when we talked about the type of the business, is that the government does use a proportionality test. And if your business is something where it's going to cost $300,000 or less to start the business, then you are kind of required to spend all of the money to get the business up and running. If the business is something that is, where you're spending a lot more money, like maybe $1 million or $2 million for the business, then perhaps you don't have to spend the full amount to meet the substantiality test. But we look at that on a case-by-case basis. And when you're purchasing a business, the substantial amount is usually going to be the purchase price. And the purchase price is normally going to be the fair market value, unless you purchase the asset from a relative. And that's something to definitely keep in mind, because the government is very suspect when the transaction involves family, because if the transaction involves family, then can create, the government may think that there's not really anything that's going on, and that there's just an exchange of money between family members. So something to keep in mind. The franchises are a great option for E2 visas. That's something definitely to look at. And then also we're going to look at talk about common good and bad E2 visa expenditures. So one second. So the common E2 expenditures that are considered good for E2 visa purposes are things like rent, things like kind of purchasing equipment, employees are good, marketing. All of those represent what we call good E2 expenditures. When we look at bad E2 visa expenditures, there are things like travel. Sometimes people will include receipts for food, like they'll even include receipts for food, like McDonald's and things like that. Training, all of those, are not very good E2 visa expenditures. The training is akin to, the cost that someone may have paid to go to school. So that's not, something that, but definitely, speak with your immigration lawyer with respect to the expenditures that you should focus on, right? Because the government, if you're starting a consulting business, they are expecting to see certain expenditures, maybe money on a website, maybe money on marketing, that you've leased premises, that you have computer equipment for more than just one person, et cetera. So there are definitely things that the government is looking at to make sure that you spent enough money to get the business up and running. So then the next area that we're going to talk about is the National Interest Waiver. And this is an area where it is new for entrepreneurs, new in terms of 2016, 2017. This is a category that we regularly use to move people from E2 to green card, or just applying for a green card. And so this falls under the EB2 category of green cards. And unlike the E2 is a non-immigrant visa, so that's no path to permanent residency. But this is a permanent residency card. So those interested in a green card, this is always a good option for you. So the first thing to keep in mind, though, is that you have to, before we even get to the National Interest Waiver criteria, you have to meet what I'm going to describe as the threshold requirements. And so what those are is that you have to have either an advanced degree, which is master's or higher, or its equivalent. And the equivalent is defined as a bachelor's degree plus 5 years of progressive work experience in the profession and post-bachelor experience. So if you got the bachelor's degree and had experience before that, that's not going to count, but post-bachelor degree experience. So, and these are either or. So it's either a master's degree or higher, or bachelor's degree plus 5. Or if you don't have either of those, so let's say someone just graduated from high school, they could still qualify under EB2 if you can meet 3 of the 7 criteria that are listed here, right? So if they have, maybe 10 years of full-time work experience, that might be 1. Some other type of degree, maybe 2. So we go through these and we see that obviously the easiest way to qualify is that someone has a master's degree or they have a bachelor's degree. Those are the easiest ways to qualify. However, sometimes it's not possible to qualify under either of those 2 mechanisms. And when that happens, we use the exceptional ability criteria to define. So, sorry about that. Okay, so now once you meet the threshold issue, now keep in mind it's just threshold issue. EB2 comes in 2 forms: National Interest Waiver and someone sponsoring you for a green card, a company sponsoring you for a green card. So the threshold issue is just that, it's a threshold issue. And then now we move to the actual details of this particular green card. And again, there are webinars that deal just with National Interest Waiver for entrepreneurs and webinars that deal with the National Interest Waiver generally. So again, I do encourage you to sign up for one of those webinars. And similarly, E2, we have a number of different E2 webinars that we have. We do encourage you to sign up to those or to go to the YouTube channel. But the way this works is there's a famous case, it's called Danisar. And this case breaks the requirements for National Interest Waiver into 3 prongs. So the first prong being that your proposed endeavor has substantial merit and national importance. So when we're dealing with entrepreneurs and investors, often we're dealing with the fact that the national importance might be job creation. So we're not, it's not job creation of 10 or 15 jobs, or, usually it's quite significant job creation. So we use a business plan to demonstrate this. But also, I think that we might get an economist report to look at what the proposed endeavor was and then extrapolate with respect to what the benefit of the economy would be, both from an indirect and direct perspective related to jobs. But also with respect to national importance, it could be that what somebody is doing, like let's say somebody's starting a company where they're making widgets, and the widgets, the government considered those very important. That obviously, then the national importance would not just be the job creation, but it might be the what it is that the person is making. So this, we define the endeavor usually very specifically, and it has to be grand. It can't be minor, or the government won't consider it of national importance, right? So that's something we work very closely with clients to go through, and just to kind of make sure that that we meet that particular prong. Now, when we go to the second prong of the person is well positioned to advance the proposed endeavor, we look at things like their education, their work experience, their whether people have invested in the project or not. Really, their ability to follow through. Do they have contracts already? Do they have a solid business plan? So, but this one, even though this seems like an easier criteria to meet, and this criteria, under E2, it's pretty, there's kind of similar related aspects to E2. The government was looking at viability of the company, but here they're not just going to accept a business plan. They really are looking for real concrete things to show that you are well positioned to advance the specific grand endeavor that you talked about in point one. So, they'll be looking for contracts, they'll be looking for investment, they'll be looking for a proven track record that you've done this before. If you say that you are going to create many jobs, they're going to look for a track record that you created many jobs in the past. So most national interest waiver petitions get denied on this particular prong, because the first prong can be crafted to meet that particular prong often, but the second one, they're really looking for specific things. Because the first one is drafted independent of the individual. It's just what is the endeavor that the individual proposes. And then the third, looking on balance as to whether or not it would be beneficial to the United States to waive the labor certification requirements. So we're going to look at some of the aspects in prong 1 and 2. However, we're also going to go back to some of the extraordinary ability criteria to utilize some of those to kind of say this person's so fantastic that the person deserves to have the labor certification waived. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is that this case kind of changed the framework in that it doesn't kind of, the national impact doesn't have to be all over the United States. You could have a national impact just in, for example, an economically depressed area within the United States. And then the other kind of piece that was unique in this case that came out is that one of the arguments that we make for prong 3 is the individual is self-employed. And as a result of that, the labor certification process is not applicable to people that are self-employed, so it doesn't really apply. And that's that's been a successful argument that we've made for entrepreneurs. And the case kind of says that planned endeavors, they don't ultimately have to be successful. However, the government does want to make sure that it's not a pipe dream and it's not just based on on a business plan. And if we look at, kind of one case that was successful, this was a case that was initially denied, and then the government, it was appealed, and then the appeals board, came in and they said, well, this guy, he started a consulting company that was supposed to help vets who came back from U.S. vets that came back from combat and help them reintegrate into the society. And he submitted expert opinion letters, news media articles of the importance of this to the society. Documentation supporting that it was difficult as people came back to integrate. Letters from experts and people in the military that talk about how important this is. And then also pointed to the government's own initiatives in this area. They presumably, when they take initiatives, that they're for things that they consider important. And then he said, well, I'm well positioned to do this because he had investment, he had contracts, he had a business plan, he had a strategy, he had emails from prospective clients confirming interest in working with the company, and sufficient capital, sufficient investment to start this up. So, really concrete things to show that he was able to do it. And then he used the argument that we talked about for self-employment, to address prong 3. Now, the next investor visa, we're not actually going to spend a lot of time on this because it's a program that really, for the most part, it's almost dead in the water because it's so difficult to realize any real benefit. But this is a program we were very hopeful for people really that aren't eligible for an E2, maybe that they would be able to use this parole program. And it's a program that would allow the person to receive an immigration benefit if they owned a small percentage of the company and they met other criteria, right? So they had an investor that the amount used to be 250,000, but it gets scaled to inflation. but they have an investor, and not just any investor, it has to be a qualified investor that invested 250,000, or other aspects you could utilize to show that the the particular endeavor has merit. Like if they don't have somebody that has invested 250,000, or they haven't got a grant, that's something that they could look at. And so if they, let's say they only got funding of, let's say, $50,000, they could look at other reliable, compelling evidence, and we list out that evidence there. But again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's really a program that unfortunately just hasn't really gained traction because of the length of time it takes to adjudicate. It's actually not a visa, it's something called parole. So you get the benefit and you have to leave and re-enter. So it really just hasn't gained much traction, but we do have individual webinars on that you can refer to. And certainly when the program starts to gain more traction, we'll focus in that area in a little bit more detail. And the last visa that we're going to talk about is the EB-5 green card. And we do a lot of this, moving people from E2 to EB-5 after their business expands. And this particular program has undergone a number of changes, mainly with respect to investment amount, but some other changes as well. When the program started, it was invest either $500,000 or $1 million. Now it's up to $800,000 or $1,050,000. The difference between, basically an individual is investing in a business in the US, and if it's $800,000, it means that the business is located in what's called a targeted employment area. And if it's a higher amount, it's not. And you're investing in a new commercial enterprise, but that's a business that started after 1990, so it can be a business that's been around for a long time. One of the big differences between this and E2 is the money does have to be invested in the actual business. So if you're buying a business, for example, let's say you're buying a restaurant and you're giving the buyer, $500,000 for the restaurant or $800,000 for the restaurant. That wouldn't work for EB-5 because the money actually has to be invested in the business and then used for job creation. So put in the bank account, spent, and used for job creation. And that is a requirement for EB-5, which is different from E2. Also, some of the amounts that are included in EB-5, in E2 cannot be included in EB-5, like, for example, administrative fees, legal fees, etc. The investment can be made over time. We just had an approval for a direct EB-5 investment recently where the individual had invested, it was $500,000 at that time, but they invested the $500,000 over a 5-year period. So that was, there's no problem doing that. And the other kind of thing to keep in mind is if your business does grow significantly, you can't include retained earnings. So let's say you made, $2 million in the first year, and then, 1.5 million of that was profit, and then it was sitting in your retained earnings, and then you spent that again in the following year. That doesn't actually count towards investment. In order for that to count, you'd have to actually pay yourself from the business, physically show the transfer, pay yourself from the business, pay tax on it, and then reinvest that money into the business. And you'd have to kind of show that clear audit trail that you're doing that. The investment has to be an equity investment, so it can be a membership unit, it can be a share, it can be a limited partnership unit, et cetera. But it can't be like a loan to the company or something like that. There can be no guaranteed returns with an EB-5 investment. In terms of creating jobs, there is a requirement that you create 10 full-time jobs 2 years after the I-526 petition has been approved. And they are full-time jobs, so not part-time jobs. And also the jobs have to be for US citizens or green card holders. So that's very different from the E2 as well. This does require a very detailed business plan if you're doing direct investment. That's what the EB-5 direct is when you're starting your own business and investing. And we mentioned already that there, it has to be the linkage to job creation, that the investment has to be linked to job creation. And when you're, what happens with this is when you get this approved, then 2 years later, you have to get your green card, you have to go back to the government and show that you actually have hired the 10 full-time workers. So that's something to keep in mind that you have to do. And so you have to keep very accurate records of the full-time positions and qualified workers that you have, that you've actually hired. And the petitions that are filed here, it's an I-526 petition and then an I-485 petition. And those, if you're in the United States, that now can be filed concurrently, the I-485, which is a great benefit because it gives you the ability to file for work and travel authorization at the same time. And then 2 years after the green card has been approved, you're going to file for an I-829 petition. And then to remove the condition showing that you actually have hired the full-time workers. So that, that in a nutshell, they're the various investor visas that exist. And, summarize them on this slide. We have the E2 visa, it has a subjective investment amount, no set job numbers, and, only for certain countries, key points. The National Interest Waiver, we have 3 kind of prongs, and always keep in mind as well, though, that you have to meet the threshold issue of advanced degree or equivalent, or exceptional ability. And then we have the International Entrepreneur Rule, which again, kind of for the most part, I think there maybe have been 1 or 2 approvals to date with this program. It was a program that was started in the Obama administration, but then it was killed during the next administration, reintroduced during the Biden administration, but really hasn't gotten a lot of traction. And then we have EB-5, which is going to be the 800,000 to $1 million and 50. The program just kind of recently kind of capped out those amounts with a number of other changes to the program related to targeted employment areas and also the filing of the I-485 concurrently. So the amounts are set now, the 10 full-time employees that you're required. And then the other kind of thing to remember about the EB-5 is there are very, very long waits for EB-5. So it takes a good 4 years to get an EB-5 petition approved. So, when you're planning out your visa strategy, you do have to keep that in mind, and you do have to kind of plan for that, especially if you do have to renew another non-immigrant visa during that period. You have to keep all of that in mind so that you are focusing on proper timing. But yeah, that is all I had to cover. And I'm just taking a look at the questions. I don't see any questions. I know that these areas are fairly complicated, but again, as I mentioned, there are other webinars that we have on each of these topics. So I do encourage you to go to them and look at them, or sign up for the webinars in the future. We have our webinar scheduled out through October, so you'll be able to do that. We're going to send you the PowerPoint presentation, a copy of this video, but also guides for these 4 visas, immigration benefits that we've talked about today. We're going to send a link where you can sign up for it, a link where you can sign up for the guides. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us. And the other thing we'll send you is a link so that you can set up a consultation for convenience, and you can book that directly with us to you can book that with us to go through exactly what any questions that you have. I see some people saying hello and hello back, and we look forward to hearing from you shortly. Okay, take care.